All right, hello, and welcome to Unit 3, Area Study 2, where we're going to be looking at the government's domestic macroeconomic goals. This is a massive topic. We're going to split it across 10 lessons, and then if you're following in my booklet, there'll be an 11th lesson where you're going to do some research into recent aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors and how they've impacted the domestic macroeconomic goals. But also, it's currently 2022. I'm going to update with an extra video in 2023 with the most up-to-date data so you know those factors. But for right now, today we're going to be looking at the nature and purpose of economic activity as well as the business cycle. So the key knowledge that we're looking at today is the difference between material and non-material living standards and the factors that affect living standards, including access to goods and services, environmental quality, physical and mental health, crime rates, and literacy. And then we're also going to look at the business cycle and its causes. So learning intention all through this topic is to understand the impact of changing economic activity on the domestic macroeconomic goals. Those goals are the goal of strong sustainable economic growth, the goal of low inflation, and the goal of full employment. And you'll learn more of those as we go through. So our success criteria today is that I can describe material and non-material living standards, and I can outline and describe the different stages of the business cycle. So let's get right into it now. So the basis of this whole topic and this first part of it before we get into the goals is all about economic activity. Economic activity is all about the general pace or speed at which productive activity is occurring nationally. It's essentially the amount of spending that's occurring or the amount of production that's occurring, and our ability to measure that and what it tells us about if the economy is speeding up or slowing down. So economic activity refers to the actions of households, individuals, firms, and governments that help to generate the production of goods and services, employment, and incomes. The level of activity is used to describe the general speed which productive activity is occurring nationally. So basically, if economic activity is increasing, we can make a lot of inferences about what is going to happen. So if economic activity is increasing, it usually means businesses are going to start increasing production. That means they may demand more labor resources and therefore unemployment will fall. Average incomes will rise and that will lead to increased spending and so on. So there are two main reasons economic activity impacts our living standards. So society can only satisfy growing needs and wants through increased production. So that's really important that we are increasing production whenever we can. And higher levels of economic activity are not sustainable in the long term due to limited non-renewable resources. So we have to make sure that economic activity doesn't increase too rapidly because that will cause a whole wealth of other issues such as high inflation, the depletion of our natural resources, etc. So to get into what our living standards are, which you'll hopefully already know, but we've got two main types of living standards. Whenever you get a question about living standards, you should always refer to both. So we've got material living standards, which is all about the physical things we have which improve our quality of life. So money in the bank, a house, a car, a laptop, a ridiculously large TV in your living room for some reason. Then we've got non-material living standards, which refer to the non-tangible aspects of life that impact our overall well-being. So things like crime rates where you live, stress levels, the amount of leisure time you have, how educated you are, all these things impact our quality of life and can have a significant impact on our overall standard of living. So with living standards, often you'll get questions in SACs and exams that say, how does blank, whatever, impact this goal and living standards? And whenever you get that question, you always need to refer to both material and non-material living standards to access the full marks. Then we get into the business cycle. So the business cycle is essentially a diagram which looks at how economic activity goes up and down in an economy in a cyclical pattern. When we look at it in a graph, you can see that it waves up and down over time, and we're expecting that over time it will continue to go up and down like this. Why it behaves like that is that essentially when economic activity is increasing too much, the government puts things in place to slow it down. Often that works too well, and therefore the government has to put things back in place to speed it up, and vice versa and we get this wave-like pattern. The government over time is basically aiming to make those peaks and troughs as low as possible so there's not as much difference, but they can be quite extreme depending on what has been put in place. Essentially, what we want from the business cycle is to see that on average over time, economic activity has been increasing. So what we want is a long-term trend line that looks something like this, where over time, on average, economic activity is increasing. And when we're kind of like achieving that and our average growth is quite good, It means we should be achieving all three domestic goals at the same time, so low inflation, economic growth, and full employment, and we refer to that as achieving domestic economic stability. We've got four main features of the business cycle that we're going to learn about on the next slide. So we have expansions, we've got contractions, we've got peaks and troughs. And so expansions refer to when economic activity is increasing. Peaks refer to when we are at the highest point before we start contracting. And troughs are when we're at the lowest point before we get back into an expansion. So what's really important about each of those features of the business cycle is knowing what is occurring in each of those stages. So the four main phases in the business cycle, we've got the expansion or recovery phase, which is signaled by rising GDP growth, falling unemployment, and inflation gradually rising. That's because economic activity is increasing, and therefore businesses see it as an opportunity to produce more to get higher profits. They'll employ more people, and therefore there'll be more employment and income. We've got the peak or the boom phase, which is where unemployment reaches its lowest levels. And because of this, spending is so high that it actually starts to cause some shortages, and inflation starts to rise as consumers bid up prices, or there's upward pressure on prices because of those shortages due to high levels of economic activity. We've got the slowdown or contraction phase, which is when GDP starts to slow. As GDP starts to slow, businesses will start to lay off workers to protect their profit margins. And also as economic activity falls, inflation will start to ease as there's now less demand for goods and services. And lastly, we've got the trough or recession stage, which is when the slowdown in the rate of economic growth gets so low and unemployment rises quite highly, and will be seen as being in a recession if GDP growth is negative in 2 consecutive quarters. So if GDP actually shrinks, so if we have negative GDP growth, that for 2 quarters, that will be seen as a recession. What's really important about this is what we were saying before, which is we want to achieve domestic economic stability, which is a desirable or ideal level of economic activity where simultaneously there's low inflation, so 2 to 3% on average over time, solid and sustainable economic growth rate, so 3 to 3.5% real GDP growth per year, and low unemployment, which is around 4.5% unemployment rate without causing inflation to accelerate. So these are the things we want to achieve via the business cycle and managing economic activity. And so lastly, over time, rises in economic activity should outweigh the falls so that the average growth can trend upwards on the business cycle. That's what we were saying earlier, that although we've got a business cycle that looks like this, we want a long-term growth on average throughout there. So a country's productive capacity controls the overall level of growth they can have sustainably over time. So this is the productive capacity is basically the limit you have on your production, the most you can produce without any other negative issues, or in the short term, the most you can produce. So this determines the sustainable rate of economic growth in the long term, because if you produce above that, it means that you are actually going to be burning through your resources too quickly for it to be manageable for future generations. And that is it for this first little introduction to Area Study 2 with economic activity and the business cycle. Hope this has been helpful. If you need any other information, feel free to comment below. Send me an email, sean@therunningeconomy.com. We'll be back next time with the 5-sector circular flow model, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is a massive chunk of really, really important information that will help you for the rest of the year. So look forward to that then, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.